This is every collector's dream come true, to head up into an attic, advertised in the paper of all places, and I was lucky enough to be the first one to get there. I feel a little bit like a jackdaw. You know, those birds that collect everything that's shiny and they pack it away? Well, that's just what a collector does. Postcards, you name it, they're up here. 30 years accumulation from about 1890, I would say. This is wonderful. There's cobwebs, there's dirt everywhere. Holy jumpers, there's some nice old papers. What's in that drawer right there? Oh gosh, oh geez, some nice promissory notes. Oh, I've been hunting for those things for years. Oh, I've got a lucky find here. This is going to be great. I'm going to make an offer on the whole kit and caboodle. Well, they say people are born collectors. I think there's some truth to that. And I started, of course, like all other collectors, collecting decimal coins, Canadian decimal coins. But that got pretty expensive after a while. And I found out that if I was going to stay in that business, I wouldn't last too long. So I gradually evolved into tokens, medals, and paper money. One of my interesting first acquisitions in tokens was a SV Skillen store token from St. Martin's, New Brunswick. Naturally, I wanted to find out something about that token, so I take a trip down to St. Martin's on a Saturday morning and ask everybody around if they know anything about the SV Skillen store. Well, they all knew where the store was, of course, but I wanted to talk to somebody who had some experience with the tokens. Finally, we narrowed down to an elderly lady who lived up the top of a hill, and I think she had gone to the store on a number of occasions as a child to get a loaf of bread, and she told us that she had used the tokens. So I asked her all the usual questions when trying to find out about tokens. You know, how did you use them? Well, she took them down to the store to get bread, and she remembers the tokens well and so on. She hadn't seen one in years. When I showed her, she said, "Oh my goodness, yes, I remember that so well." And then she said, or I asked her, I guess, because most store tokens come in denominations of 5 cent, 1 cent, 10 cent, 25 cent, 50 cent, and so on. And the one I had was a 5 cent denomination. So I said to the elderly lady, who was quite deaf, I said, what denominations were these tokens issued in? She said, Presbyterian, of course. And I got a great chuckle out of that. And after I clarified what I wanted, she said that she only remembered the 5 cent token, the one I had. So that was kind of an interesting story, which leads me into why people collect and what kind of enjoyment do they get out of the collecting. And really, to me, there are 3 phases of collecting. One is the chase. The second phase is the acquisition of an actual piece. And the third phase is probably the research, the finding out about a particular piece. One interesting piece that comes to mind is the Yukon overprint banknote of the Bank of Commerce. In the late 1890s, the government of Canada asked the Bank of Commerce to set up a branch in Dawson City. As we all know, there was gold was found in the Yukon at about that time. There was a lot of lawlessness, and there were a lot of real characters that were up there looking for gold. Almost everybody thought they were going to get instantly rich. And so up they went by the thousands, and this created all sorts of problems. The government wanted to collect its mining royalties, and they used the Bank of Commerce as its government agency to do that. And it also served as a banker for other purposes for the miners and people that went up there, business people. This note, you will note, is actually a regular Bank of Commerce note. But on either end of it, you could see in large blue letters, the Yukon. And it's called the Yukon overprint. Oddly enough, it's a very scarce note today, but this all existed and happened back in 1893 or thereabouts, when the Bank of Commerce decided to open this branch in Dawson City, and they had to somehow ship notes out to the branch. Of course, it was a very hazardous route. They had to climb mountains, through streams, boats and canoes and what have you, and terrible weather. And of course, all the time they had to worry about people stealing from them because there were all these lawless characters out there. They did not countersign the notes in Toronto, where they were sent from. And the other thing they didn't do was to stamp them. So when they got out there, they stamped these notes, Yukon, so they knew they were legitimate notes that had come from Toronto, and then they countersigned them out there. It's a very interesting part of our Canadian history, and these notes today go anywhere from $15,000 to $20,000 each. They're very, very scarce. Now, banknotes aren't the only area that collectors collect, and tokens, but I find medals to be very interesting. And in a coin shop in New Brunswick, one day out of the blue, a gentleman brought in a University of New Brunswick Douglas gold medal, 1829. It just happened that the dealer called me, and it was only the second one that's ever been found of that particular medal. I said to him, "What do you want for it?" He gave me a price, I bought the piece, and I brought it home. I did not know who actually got this medal, and that's puzzling because it didn't have anybody's name engraved on it, and the Douglas medals generally don't anyway, but I was awfully curious as to who won this and when it might have been issued. About a year later, the same gentleman came into the store and brought in 2 silver medals. And on these silver medals, it had W.P. Dole, that was the man's name who won them, and the dates 1835 and 1836. Now, Mr. Dole must have been quite a mathematician, because this was arithmetic class, and on the reverse of the medal, it has HA, which would stand for highest average, in arithmetic class. And so these were 2 silver medals, and I thought, now I wonder if this Mr. Dole, who won these arithmetic medals in 1834, 1835, and the same man brought the gold medal in earlier and the 2 silver a year later, you don't suppose Mr. Dole won the Douglas gold medal. So I immediately go to the roll of winners that I had researched many years before, and sure enough, in 1849, Dole won the Douglas gold medal. So we were able to connect the silver medals with the gold medal and make it all the more interesting. Now I have to go further. I know nothing about H.P. Dole. I'm sure he must have been pretty successful in life. He was a top scholar. So now my next project is to find out, what did he do with his life? Where did he end up? And I haven't got the foggiest idea at this point in time. So as I said, we know nothing about H.P. Dole and what he ended up doing in life. So now I've got to the research. Third of the project comes into play. And I've got to find out about this gentleman. Now, where do I look? Well, I could start by looking in probably St. John newspapers and find an obituary at some point. We would assume that he died, if he won the medal in 1849, he probably was around 20 years old. And let's assume he lived to 70. That's 50 years later. Well, that would be around the turn of the century. Newspapers may have an obituary on H.P. Dole. We might look up the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, and his name might be in there for that period of time. And there's any number of sources that one can go to and check out microfilmable newspapers and what have you to see if this fella has made a contribution to Canadian society. Now, last amongst these little groupings is the story of Le Chameau. And Le Chameau was a ship, French ship, that brought settlers to passengers, 369 I believe they were, to Quebec City, and in 1725. And unfortunately, the Chameau never made it to Quebec City. And on board was a huge stash of silver and gold coin that was going to be used to handle all the budgetary requirements for the colony of Quebec for a whole year. It got into a gale off Cape Breton, was sunk, and all the coins and everything on board went to the bottom of the sea. In 1965, Alex Storm and some partners of his found, he was a scuba diver, they found where the wreck was located, and they actually found these coins on the bottom of the ocean. The silver coin, which is a French coin of course, an écu, it suffered a lot of damage to it because the salt water of course ate away at the surface of the coin, and you can barely make out the inscription on the coin on either side, and on the reverse and obverse, that's called on a coin. But the gold pieces, because gold does not react with any element, they came out just about as good as the day that they were minted. These are louis d'ors, and they're quite valuable. But this has a fascinating story, this particular louis d'or. After Storm brought these coins up to the surface, they were taken to New York and sold by an auction firm by the name of Park Burnett. The Moncton Coin Club had some money in its treasury and said, will you buy, or we asked one of the dealers who was attending the show, would you buy one of these gold coins for our archives? He said, sure, I certainly will. He paid $300 for this particular piece, and it landed up in the archives in Moncton in 1973 or thereabouts, and was there until 1984 when Moncton hosted the National Numismatic Association of Canada. We needed some money, some seed money, so we sold this louis d'or to a collector in Victoria, British Columbia for $1,500. He kept it, and he passed away in the late 80s, around 1990. And I was in Toronto at a coin show, and lo and behold, there was a dealer there selling the effects of this collector from Victoria, British Columbia. And amongst all the coins there was this louis d'or that I knew had come from the Chameau wreck. I purchased it for $800, brought it back to Moncton, and it now resides in my collection. So this particular gold coin went from France to Louisbourg, supposedly to Quebec, but never made it there. So it went to the bottom of the ocean around Louisbourg. Then it went to New York, to Moncton, to Victoria, British Columbia, to Toronto, and back to Moncton. So it's a fascinating story of how coins and how one learns a lot of history from coins. A lot of people ask when you're collecting coins, what do you keep coins in? Well, this is something that you don't keep coins in, but in the old days they used what was called a coin cabinet. This would be a cabinet, this particular one, that would sit on your desk. And it had two doors at the front that opened like so. And then you can see inside it consists of these narrow shells. And they just came out. And you can see that they would put the medals or tokens or coins on a piece of felt on these narrow drawers. It's not recommended today because first of all, security is not good, and sometimes the coins are moving around in there and bump against each other and get scratched up. Now, coin collectors are, as we said in the beginning, collecting is a special breed of cat, and they collect a lot of interesting things that have to do with coins and banking and what have you. And if you look over here on the shelf, you'll see a small collection of banks. And these banks I find very fascinating. And one of the interesting ones, of course, is the Bank of New Brunswick. And this one right down here happens to be one from Moncton, New Brunswick. And you'll see that in one end there's a slot to put your coin in. In the other end's a little circle where you put paper money in. You roll it up and put it in. And on the front is the plaque that says Bank of New Brunswick, Moncton, New Brunswick, and you'll see there's a key that opens, unlocks, and locks the bank. Back in the early days, it was not easy for the settlers to get into the city to the bank branch. So what they did one of two things. They gave one of these banks to the settler, to the people that lived out in the rural areas. And they would either come and unlock the bank at their homes and take the money and deposit it for them in a bank account in Moncton, we'll say. Or the people would bring the bank into the bank in Moncton if they happened to be in the city, and the bank would unlock the bank, take the money out, deposit it, lock it back up, keep the key, and send the bank back with the rural people. It's an interesting little phase of early banking in New Brunswick, and these banks today are very, very scarce. Now, speaking of banking, back in the days before we had bank branches in all of the cities and towns, merchants and settlers and people that lived off the land and off the sea had to have some way of transacting money transactions from one store to a person or what have you. And in the early days, they used promissory notes. And I have two notes here in pounds, shillings, and pence, which was the currency of the day before Confederation in New Brunswick. And this one, you'll notice, is pre-printed to Messrs. Joseph Kennard and Company. Now, the name Kennard should ring some bells with most people. Samuel Kennard was his brother, and he was in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and you've all heard of the Kennard shipping lines. And Joseph Kennard was Samuel's brother, who lived up in the Chatham area of New Brunswick, was very involved with shipbuilding, sawmills, grist mills, and he had over 2,000 employees at one time. So the days of the Irvings and people like that in New Brunswick with forest products and so on didn't start with the Irvings. It actually started way back in the early 1800s with people like Joseph Kennard. So this is a promissory note issued by Kennard, all pre-printed. All he had to do was fill in the numbers and sign the name, and the people who were buying from him signed their name to it, and this was a promise to pay them on a certain date. So this was really early banking in New Brunswick and early bank notes. You can see how one can just be fascinated with all the different phases of coin collecting. I was in Halifax attending a coin show, and I went up to a dealer's table, and on the table he had a metal die. And this is the actual die that was used to strike a medal of the Halifax Floral Association. That got my curiosity up because it had a beautiful design, and it was by Ellis, which was a forerunner of Burke's, and they actually cut this die and actually issued medals off of it. With the die, and I'll just set it down because it's very heavy, but was a silver and a bronze medal made from that die. So I bought the 3 pieces, and the chap that sold them to me said he thought that they had issued a gold. Well, in the meantime, I wrote a letter to the Halifax Herald, to the letters to the editor, and I said, can anybody out there in your readership tell me about the Halifax Floral Association? A gentleman, an elderly gentleman from way out Musquodoboit Harbor way, said, yes, I was a member of the Halifax Floral Association, and it existed around the early 1920s. And and he remembered the medals well, and so on. So he gave me some history, and that was a third of the fun. The acquisition was a third, and of course the chase is always worth a third to me. So about 2 years after that, I was in Halifax to another show, and I had nothing to do. I went across to an antique dealer who was near the hotel where the show was being held, and I asked the lady that was there, "Do you have any medals?" And she said, "No, we don't carry medals." So we were persistent. We kept asking a lot of questions, and we must have been asking the right questions, because she said, "If you can hang on a minute, I'm going to phone my husband." So she called her husband, who was at his residence, and we walked up to the residence with his permission, and he said he had some medals at home. So we said, "Do you mind if we have a look at them?" So he pulled them out, we looked at them. Nothing of great interest to me particularly, but just as I was getting up to leave my armchair and leave the house, thanking him and so on, I noticed a case over on a coffee table. And I said, "Do you mind if I look in that case? It looks like there might be a medal." He says, "There just might be a medal there." And I opened it up, and guess what was there? The gold medal of the Halifax Floral Association, awarded with person's name on the back. And I was just thrilled to death, because then I completed the set of a bronze, silver, gold medal of the Halifax Floral Association with the original die, which is you just never see, and it just made my day. So you can see how collecting can be a fascinating thing to do. The chase is the exciting part of it. You know where a piece is, so you go after it and have some fun looking for it. The second part of it, of course, is almost anticlimactic to me, is the actual purchase of the piece. But then another exciting phase is the going out and doing the research on the piece with old newspapers and old books and old dictionaries and whatever is available out there, and even interviewing elderly people who may have worked at some of these firms and so on. Coin collecting is a hobby, was a hobby of kings. Now everybody collects a few coins, and it's just the greatest hobby on earth.